All right. So sorry about the replacement of yesterday's class with just a video. We got the live kind of recording here today. So I introduced the idea of monopolistic competition in that video. We'll kind of revisit it here today. Couple things before we get into material. So we'll have that last final participation quiz from today. I think I mentioned this. So in the syllabus, sorry, I haven't mentioned this. In the syllabus, it says that I dropped the two lowest of these participation quizzes. I believe I said, kind of thinking about a regular semester, I said I'll drop the 4. Because I said that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of, you guys get a little bit of a gift. I will end up dropping the 4 lowest participation quizzes, your 2 lowest quizzes, and now your lowest module reading. So I've got it set in the assignments tab to currently now do that. So it's dropping your lowest module reading, right? It's dropping your 4 lowest participation quizzes, and then dropping your 2 lowest quiz scores. Now, obviously, that's going to change a little bit because these due dates haven't passed for the last 4 participation quizzes. Actually, sorry, not 4, the last 3, and they haven't passed for the last 2 quizzes. Which after today's class, that module 13 quiz will be up there. All of those are due by the end of the day tomorrow. So once those due dates are passed and you've completed everything, Canvas should be giving you an accurate idea of what your grade is in each of those categories with the lowest drop, right? 2 lowest quizzes, 4 lowest participation quizzes, and currently this one should be accurate, your lowest module reading. And then you can use that to figure out your grade tool if you really wanted to at this point. Once you've got everything completed, you don't really need those different tabs. So kind of revisit this here. So you can go ahead and enter in all your quiz scores on participation quizzes on these tabs. And it would then kind of drop your lowest. Or what should be true once those due dates have passed and you've completed all those, your grade that you're seeing on Canvas should be the same as this participation grade that's kind of with the lowest dropped. You can then play around with different grades on the final to see what your hypothetical grade in the class would be. Okay, so once you've completed all those assignments, these 2 rows really should match up. So if you really wanted to, you could just go to Canvas and, let's say I see an 86 there. I see, I don't know, 90. I see 77. Here you have my 2 exam scores. I could then play around with, okay, if I do really bad, okay, that puts me in a C range. If I just get kind of an average C, okay, I'm still in the B range. If I get a 90 here, it's going to push me up. I'd have to do really well here, probably to get close to that. Yep. So I probably just, given this person's grades, couldn't quite get to the A. You can kind of play around with that tool before we have that final exam, which will be Friday. And I will get that posted tomorrow after tomorrow's class. You'll see that final exam pop up. So it'll pop up under this final exam materials category. It'll be open a little bit longer than the midterm. So instead of like 11:15 to 3:15, I've got it set to be 10:30 to 3:30. So a little bit more time, kind of gives you some flexibility with when you take it Friday. When you sit down to take it, instead of having an hour and 15 minutes, you'll have an hour and 30 minutes, so a little bit longer. There's 30 questions instead of 25. So if you want to give you a little more time to be able to kind of complete those. And I'll put an announcement up about this after we get done with class today as well, once we've kind of finished all the material with these details about the final. Okay. Any logistic questions for me before we kind of jump into material where I left off in that recording, which was all the way down here. So we talked about advertising. We're now going to kind of think about, I looked at monopolistically competitive markets in that video. Whoops. There we go. In the short run. In the long run, what'll end up being true is that these perfectly competitive markets, we get some traits that start to look a little bit less similar to a monopolist and a little bit more like a perfectly competitive market. So just to do a little bit of review from that video, and then also to think about the long run. So what's going to happen? Right? So let's say we started out and I've got this monopolistically competitive firm. Okay. So I'm going to draw in their average total cost curve here. Their marginal cost hits it at its minimum point, right? Same cost structure we've been looking at. But let's assume, right, for a second, And let's see, what do I want to do first to make this kind of easier to see? So we'll start out with this one. I know it's different in the slides, but I think this is worthwhile. So let's say here's the monopolistically competitive firm, right? What'll end up being true is if we were in the short run, they should choose the optimal quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? Just like a monopolist would. They then go up to the demand curve to set that price, okay? Now, we could still have, in this scenario, we still have that the price is above our marginal cost. So we said that difference between price and marginal cost, that was going to be the markup of these firms. So monopolists have markups as well. We just didn't really discuss it. With these monopolists and competitive markets, we kind of give that difference between price and marginal cost a name, and that's the markup. Okay. So if this was like our initial scenario, what is true about the profits of the firm? Well, here, if price is below average total cost, our profit equation is the exact same as what we were looking at for monopolists and perfectly competitive firms, which is the quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average total cost. So here, profits would be what? Negative, right? Price is below average total cost here. So what's going to happen in this market? Well, if there's negative profits, even if I were to draw in my average variable cost and price is above average variable, so they kind of continue to operate, right? They have the same decision that these perfectly competitive firms do in terms of shutting down or staying open. So let's just assume that price was above average variable cost, they stay open. What'll happen over time? Well, moving towards the long run, if profits are negative, some firms are going to exit this market. Now, remember, this wasn't the entire market demand curve. This was only a portion of market demand. Right? So if firms exit, what happens is this firm is going to get a higher portion, or the amount of the overall demand they get is going to increase. So their demand curve and their marginal revenue curve are going to increase. And I get this is a lot going, it's kind of tough. The slides I think will help this a little bit as well. Where's kind of our new point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost? All right, and I think I drew this a little extreme, but I think it's good. So they choose a higher quantity, right? They're facing more of the overall market demand. There's fewer firms, it's kind of splitting it. They go up to their demand curve, right? So their price is going to be higher. And notice that gap in between price and average total cost, it's getting smaller and smaller, right? So as firms exit this market, each existing firm that doesn't leave gets a higher portion of demand, raising up their demand curve. This will continue until we get to this point where in the long run, got our average total cost curve here, got my marginal costs. Here I need to get, there we go. So I want, so here's my demand curve, here's my marginal revenue curve. In the long run, firms continue to exit this market until that long run quantity results in a price that's exactly equal to my average total cost. Profits are zero. There's now no longer an incentive for firms to enter or exit this market. Okay. So the fact that we don't have any barriers to entry, even though we can have short run negative profits, and we'll look at an example where we can also see positive short run profits, firms can enter and exit. If they exit, all the existing firms are going to get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. So the demand curve shifts up until we get to the point where profits are zero. If we start out with positive profits, firms will start to enter. Now each firm is going to have a smaller portion of the overall market demand curve. We're going to see this decrease, right, until we get profits being equal to zero. So what is this? I think I've got some, spent some time creating these for a reason. But I've got some animations that'll kind of walk us through this as well. So in the long run, firm entry and exit will still push price to be equal to average total cost for these firms, and we'll still have profits of zero. Now we're still going to see that there's a markup, and I'll kind of point this out in our graphs, right? Or that the price is going to be above the firm's marginal cost, and we'll see that they're not going to get to that long run equilibrium point of a perfectly competitive market, which is at the very lowest point of the average total cost curve. They're going to actually be up on the portion of the average total cost where it's still decreasing. Okay. So here I've kind of got an initial scenario, right? Well, there we go. There it is. So I've started out, I've got positive profits here, right? So this is my short run. You know, where does the firm choose to maximize profits where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue? So down here at this quantity, they then go up to the demand curve to set the price. Price is above average total cost. If I take the difference between price and average total cost, multiply it by the quantity, well, that would just be the height of this rectangle and the width. That area would represent positive profits. Now notice that price is still above their marginal cost of that quantity, so we still have a markup. Right? If this exists, what do firms do? Well, if there's positive profits, firms will enter this market as we move towards the long run. If they enter this market, I don't know, these shifted. Might be a compatibility thing here. Sorry. So as they enter this market, each existing firm has a smaller portion of the overall demand. So now, relative to the old demand curve, where's that new quantity they're going to choose? Well, the new demand curve, marginal revenue will be twice as steep as it, right? So firms enter, each existing firm has a smaller portion of overall demand. Now marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at this lower quantity. They go up the demand curve to set the price. So firms will enter this market until that price, right? As long as that demand curve is up here, profits would still be positive, all the way until enough firms join where profits are zero. There's now no incentive for any firm to enter this market. Okay. Now, you'll notice even at that point, we're not to the lowest point of our average total cost curve, right? That lowest point is where marginal cost would intersect average total. So we still, even in the long run for a monopolistically competitive market, end up with a price that's above that minimum point of the average total cost curve, or the point that we know perfectly competitive firms would be at. And we'll kind of draw a comparison of monopolistically competitive to perfectly competitive firms here in just a second. Okay. Now, let's say we had the flip side, right? Where I start out kind of in my first example that I drew for us, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at a quantity where what? Price is below average total, so profits here are negative. If that's the case, what will firms do? Firms will exit that market. As they exit, the firms that remain get a larger portion of the overall market demand. So the demand curve the firm faces increases. Their marginal revenue is twice as steep. As firms exit, each existing firm gets a larger portion of demand until we're at a quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, where the price they're setting up on their demand curve is exactly equal to average total cost. Profits are zero. There's now no incentive for any more firms to exit. So once again, price is still going to be above the marginal cost for the firm. We still have a markup. However, we're not at that minimum point of our average total cost curve here, even in the long run when we're looking at monopolistically competitive firms' decisions or monopolistically competitive markets. Okay. All right. So we kind of have whether or not we start out with negative, or positive profits. Firm entry and exit will lead us to this long run market equilibrium where we have price being set exactly equal to average total cost, or our profits are zero. Okay. So I kind of already mentioned this. We still have a markup. We're not out at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. And so we're still going to have some deadweight loss. So really, where does this deadweight loss come from, right? We can kind of think about, well, relative to where the perfectly competitive market would choose based off of if this was the demand curve they faced. The perfectly competitive market would actually choose that point where their marginal costs, representing supply, would be equal to demand. So because that monopolistic competitive firm chooses a higher price and a lower quantity, every unit that market is not producing, we're losing out on the difference between the demand and the marginal, demand and marginal cost, or the supply of the firm, the marginal benefits in the market and the marginal cost in the market. So we still have deadweight loss when we have these monopolistically competitive markets. Now, here I have an example where there's positive profits. that would still exist even if we had zero profit. So if I think about if I had something depicting zero profits, where would my deadweight loss be? Well, the perfectly competitive firm would actually choose a point out here. So I would still have, right? So perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive. I would still have deadweight loss even if I had profits being equal to zero. So the slides, I think, depicted a positive profit scenario, but that deadweight loss exists regardless of what profits for those firms are. Okay. So to give a little more insight into kind of long run comparisons, and I think this is in the slides, but I think it helps to build it out. So let's say I'm thinking about quantity. I've got price. I've got my average total costs. I'll try to draw these to be exactly the same here. And then I've got my marginal costs hitting the average total at their minimum point. Okay. So here, I'm going to draw an example where if I had, I try to draw it to scale here. You can kind of see price is exactly equal to average total cost at that quantity that monopolistically competitive market would choose. Okay. So if that's the case, we still have kind of profits of these monopolistically competitive markets being equal to zero, right? But what price would result if we had a perfectly competitive market? Well, if a perfectly competitive market, kind of weird, but remember, what did we say the demand curve actually was? The demand curve actually was simply whatever that perfectly competitive equilibrium price was, right? Every firm was a price taker. So we know that for the perfectly competitive firms, that price is their marginal revenue. So perfectly competitive firms' marginal revenue. They would actually be choosing to be out here at that quantity where that marginal revenue hits marginal cost or the lowest possible point of the average total cost curve. Okay. So the monopolistic competitive firm, we're kind of writing this out, will choose a higher price than the perfectly competitive market will. Or sorry, I shouldn't say they'll choose. It will result in a higher price than the perfectly competitive market would. Now, this is each firm, right? But if each firm is producing less, then we kind of add this all up. We also know that the monopolistically competitive quantity will be less than the perfectly competitive quantity in the long run. Now, here, price is equal to average total costs. This is kind of a weird, I shouldn't say weird, but maybe counterintuitive, where the profits in the long run of both firms in these different types of markets would be equal to zero. Okay. And then here, price is exactly equal to marginal cost. So if I wanted to think about, well, what is the markup for a perfectly competitive firm? Well, price minus marginal cost, if they're the same thing, should be zero. Now here, price will definitely be above marginal cost. So if we're thinking about the markup for monopolistic competitive market, that'll still be some positive value. Okay. Now, another thing that we will define is when we're comparing the quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm versus a perfectly competitive firm would choose, we're going to call that difference. And we know the perfectly competitive quantity is higher. So that difference in the quantity, we're going to call excess capacity, right? Now, the reason why is because it's the additional units that this firm is not producing where they would still be decreasing their per unit costs. So we're thinking about what's better for society overall. It's to be operating where our per unit costs are at their lowest or we're kind of using our resources the most efficiently. The monopolistic competitive market or firms would not choose to be at that point. And so we'll kind of call that difference excess capacity here. It's the number of additional units they could be producing and still experiencing lower per unit costs. Excuse me. Okay. Any questions over anything there? All right. So kind of have this kind of side by side in the slides as well, right? We're really just thinking about the perfectly competitive market gets to what we would call like the efficient scale of production, where per unit costs are at their lowest, right? The monopolistic competitive market doesn't quite get there. That difference between the efficient scale of production, or the perfectly competitive quantity, and the monopolistically competitive quantity, that's going to be what we call excess capacity. And then we said there's no markup. Price is exactly the same as marginal cost for a perfectly competitive market. Here we have some markup existing, even in the long run when profits are zero for these monopolistically competitive firms. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So it operates in a slightly different way than perfectly competitive markets. Remember, we said when there was positive profits for a perfectly competitive market, firms entered, and it still decreased the demand curve. It's just that their demand curve was horizontal. The same thing applies, right? When firms enter a monopolistically competitive market, it's just that kind of decrease in demand, right? It's not a horizontal demand curve. It has some downward slope to it. Okay. All right. So we think about why are we going to have that deadweight loss that's created? It's really coming from kind of two areas. So the first is going to be we've got excess capacity, right? The monopolistically competitive market or firm is not choosing to be on that lowest cost minimizing output or the lowest per unit costs. Okay. And also, why did this? Something's going on with my slides when I copy them from, or I download them from Canvas. I should throw them on a OneDrive here. And then the other kind of area where we're seeing some loss is that the price is no longer equal to marginal cost, right? We have some markup where that price the monopolistic competitive market chooses is above their marginal cost. Okay. Under perfect competition, we had no markup. And so, right, these are kind of the two sources essentially of deadweight loss that we're seeing. And really in like you can think of, this is like the same thing that was happening with a monopolist when we compared them to a perfectly competitive market. They were producing a lower quantity and they were kind of at a point where they weren't at the lowest point of their average total cost or per unit cost. And so both of those were creating that deadweight loss. Okay. Now, we could initially might think, okay, what are the welfare implications of having a market where you have differentiated products or you have this monopolistic competition going on? Well, because price is above marginal cost and the market quantity is below that socially efficient quantity, we might initially think, well, that's a bad thing for society, right? So problem is it's kind of hard for the government to regulate these markets because if the firms are already earning zero profits, so if I go back to thinking about if they're earning zero profits at the current price they're setting, if the government comes in and tries to put in kind of this price ceiling, right? Well, if I tried to put a price ceiling here where I was at the minimum point of the average total cost, what's true about that price? It would be above the consumer's marginal benefit. So would the consumers here be willing to pay for it? No, right? So we can't really regulate these monopolistic competitive markets because if I try to lower the price, nobody's going to buy these units. I'd still be stuck. The last unit purchased would still be where that price is equal to the person's marginal benefit. Okay. So it's really hard to regulate these markets. In addition to that, even if I was to try to lower that price, you know, I can't regulate the price of every single, if I think about like fast food place, there's slightly differentiated product. You know, how can I tell each person, you know, some of them are going to have different demand curve, different slope. I'd have to set different prices for every single firm. It's almost impossible, right? Just a logistics nightmare. Okay. So it's really hard for us to regulate these markets, unlike when we looked at a monopoly market, it was a little bit easier to regulate, right? One firm, right? They've got one specific product. It was a little bit easier to kind of evaluate. Okay. Now we could have also think about maybe it's not just that with monopolistic competitive markets, maybe it's that the number of firms isn't optimal to what the number of firms would be in a perfectly competitive market. However, if we think about what are some externalities that could exist from a monopolistically competitive market that wouldn't exist if we had a completely homogeneous product. So if you think about when there's new firms or there's additional firms in these monopolistic competitive markets, well, really what you're getting is more product variety. Okay. So even though there's more product variety, right, when we have more firms, that's going to cause losses as we see more firms. We're not splitting demand, right? We're getting a smaller portion of overall demand. Also, people's willingness to substitute, there's going to be closer substitutes now. So the kind of slope of the demand curve of these monopolistically competitive market space will be like getting flatter and flatter. So as we see more firms enter this market, right, there's going to be some gain to consumers from having more firms and an introduction of more products. But there's also going to be some loss, some negative externalities to the producers because they don't have as, as steep of a demand curve. They don't have as large of a portion of the overall market demand curve. So it's kind of hard to say. Once again, it's almost like, in economics, a lot of times the answer is indeterminate, right? What would the optimal number of firms be? Well, as we add more firms, there's this product variety externality that's positive to consumers. However, there's this negative externality that's existing to producers. It's really hard to regulate, okay? In fact, just to kind of give somewhat of an insight how you could actually, let's see. Let's say I had those same two examples. So let's say I've got average total costs. And we said for these perfectly competitive firms, we kind of know that well, I'm just going to put these on. We'll just draw one out. I think it'll make it easier to see. So let's say we had quantity for kind of each firm here. And we're thinking about, got my average total cost, got my marginal cost, got my demand curve, got my marginal revenue curve. So even if we're at this long run equilibrium, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost for these monopolistically competitive markets, they go up to the demand curve to set the price. We said, well, the quantity that we would see in this perfectly competitive market would be kind of out here at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So what is kind of dead weight loss here? Well, if this was the portion, we could kind of think about for every unit that's not produced here, and technically I should have had this drawn a little bit differently, but you can imagine, kind of get the same idea. We have this dead weight loss, right? So even though there's a lower quantity in the market, why could that potentially be a good thing? So this was each firm. If we instead think about the total quantity in the market, right? And we had our market demand curve and our market supply curve, we said, okay, yes, the perfectly competitive quantity should be out here where the prices, or sorry, where supply is equal to demand. We know that if each firm is choosing a lower quantity, maybe the quantity in the market from these monopolistically competitive firms is going to be lower. So it looks like we've got kind of this dead weight loss that exists. Okay. So it's kind of weird, and I wouldn't push you this far in a quiz or an exam, but I think it is interesting to at least discuss it. If I have a perfectly competitive market, yes, I would gain all of my dead weight loss back, right? So we would gain all of this back if it was perfectly competitive. But let's assume that by having a monopolistically competitive market, there are products out there now. So this is, think about it this way. Let's say I went to, if I'm thinking about like school uniforms, I've got a homogeneous product. Everyone's wearing the exact same thing. We're willing to pay a certain amount of money for it. It results in some total surplus. If I don't have school uniforms and I allow companies to create different styles of clothing, well, now there's there's benefits to consumer. Now wearing clothes, I'm going to get a higher marginal benefit than I was before. So if I'm just thinking about the number of like items of clothing bought to wear to school instead of school uniforms, there's actually some additional benefit to consumers, right? Or the marginal social benefit when I allow people to express themselves through their clothes is actually higher than simply the demand from wearing from wearing kind of school uniforms. So what am I really doing by allowing the market to remain monopolistic competitive? there's more product variety. Consumers value that. There's going to be some additional positive externality to society. So notice, yes, we're losing this surplus because it's a monopolistic competitive market, but how much is society gaining every unit that's purchased? There's this positive externality. So what would we really be trying to do? Well, if the positive externalities that exist from this monopolistic competitive market are greater than that deadweight loss from if we forced it to be perfectly competitive and have just one homogeneous product, well, then we're actually better off as a society allowing this market to be monopolistic competitive. Okay. Once again, I probably wouldn't push it quite that far, but to try to be more complete in our discussion of these monopolistic competitive markets, if these positive externalities exist because of product variety to the consumers, maybe it's actually better for our society to be at that monopolistically competitive quantity. Okay. All right. I think that is good for there. So I've got some kind of slides in here. It's a little bit of interesting discussion. Once again, I'm not going to kind of probably put any questions on the quiz or exam here about brand names. But with advertising, we can kind of think about brand names in a similar way. It's a little bit easier with brand names because just brand naming something, it's likely that the costs aren't going to be, we're not thinking about these huge fixed costs like we have for advertising. So, the critics of brand names would be that maybe it's creating like false marginal benefit that consumers, how much they benefit from buying. I think the example I used was for a brand was like I went and bought Kroger Benadryl as opposed to the actual brand name Benadryl. It's the same exact product. So if these brands are creating a false sense of marginal benefit, they're not actually any better. I might be convincing consumers to buy something that doesn't give them additional benefit. So it's like there really is no gain in consumer surplus. And I'm just extracting more surplus from consumers there. I'm generating deadweight loss because these brand names create product differentiation, even though there might not be some that even exists. Okay. However, we can kind of think about if we eliminated those, potentially, right? We eliminate monopolistic competitive market. If we get rid of kind of trademarks and brand names, everybody has to kind of, is really selling a homogeneous product. We'd end up at a perfectly competitive price, which would be lower, which is better for society or better for kind of raising total surplus. However, if the brand names do convey something about quality, that there is demand differences between Kroger's brand of Benadryl and the actual, Benadryl brand Benadryl, well, then it's then they're really two different markets, and we would have two different demand curves. Then brand names would actually kind of make sense. Okay? Once again, I don't want to waste too much time on this. It is interesting to start to kind of think about these more complicated issues, and really, I think the next level of economics, you would dive deeper. Really, these are the kind of markets we probably see more in practice, are these monopolistic competitive markets. And so we want to analyze these types of questions a little bit more in depth, right? But for the sake of time, and for the sake that we're getting close to the end of the semester here, I want to make sure we have time to kind of prepare for that final, also for the last quiz. So we'll look at the participation quiz questions for today, and then I'll probably jump into that practice exam, and we'll cover the monopolistically competitive questions in it today, so we kind of keep the class cohesive today, like kind of all the same topic, and then likely focus on some of the older stuff tomorrow when we're doing review. Okay. So which of the following is going to be true about a monopolistically competitive market relative to a monopolist in a perfectly competitive market? Excuse me. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and we have to think a little bit harder about what we're doing. So if we're comparing them to a monopolist, and we're comparing them to a perfectly competitive market, we kind of already made the perfectly competitive market comparisons today. So we said you can kind of think about this as if I'm looking at, here's my average total costs, here's my marginal costs, right? When I'm looking at perfectly competitive versus monopolistically competitive markets, right? The perfectly competitive point, if I had my demand curve in here, okay, and then I have marginal revenue, try to draw this to scale. Not quite there, but you can imagine. So monopolistically competitive quantity, we said relative to that perfectly competitive quantity is always going to be lower, and the price they set, sorry, MC, PC, right? So the price of the perfectly competitive firm would choose is always going to be lower. The quantity is always going to be higher. Okay. So that one's, I think, a little bit easier because we're kind of looking at everything on the firm level basis. Okay. However, if we're comparing a monopolistic competitive firm to a monopoly, what we have to remember, well, the monopolist faces the entire market demand curve, right? So whatever our marginal costs are, right, that would kind of represent supply. The monopolist, is choosing where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, going up to that demand curve to set the price. We know that the perfectly competitive quantity in the market would be out here. Okay. So we're thinking about comparing firms and not the market in this example. We know that the perfectly competitive market is going to choose a higher quantity. So the monopolistic competitive market is choosing a lower quantity. So that's the one that's going to be true. However, they're not going to choose a lower price. We said they're going to choose a higher price in the perfectly competitive market. Now, relative to the monopolists, right? If we think about what's happening at the firm level, well, at the firm level, the monopolist demand is going to be way out here, right? They've got all of demand, not just a portion of it. So the price and quantity that a monopolist chooses relative to one firm in a monopolistically competitive market will always be greater. Right? So we can kind of think about it here as the quantity that a monopolist as a firm is going to choose always is going to be greater than the quantity that a monopolistically competitive firm chooses. The price will always be greater as well. Okay. However, if we're thinking about comparing the monopolistically competitive market as a whole, what we'd really be doing is taking how much each firm is producing and like add up all of those quantities to get total market supply. So when we're thinking about the entire market, where would the monopolistically competitive firm fall? Well, we know that each firm is producing less than the perfectly competitive firms. So we know that quantity is going to be lower than this, but they don't have as much market power as a monopolist. So what's going to be true is our monopolistically competitive quantity is going to be somewhere in between those two extremes. And then kind of the average price of those monopolistically competitive markets will also be somewhere in between, right? So because I'm one of many firms, I'm not going to have as much market power as a monopolist would. And so the price that I'm setting is going to be a little bit lower. And then the total quantity in the market of all those firms relative to a monopolist is going to be a little bit higher. So if we're thinking about comparing it to a monopolist, the higher prices, no, the prices they set will be lower than a monopolist because they don't have as much power in the market. And then the quantity is going to be lower than the monopoly market. Well, no, that was where we said each firm would produce a lower quantity. But when I'm comparing it to the entire market, the quantity that we'd see from a monopolistically competitive market, there's not as much market power, so they won't restrict quantity near as much as a monopolist would. Okay. So be careful on questions like this, that if we're thinking about comparing them to like a firm or if we're looking at the market overall. So the one that will be true is if each firm is producing lower, right, the total quantity in the market for a monopolistic competitive market would be lower than perfectly competitive. Okay. And then kind of this one should be easy. So everyone should get this one right. I'll look at these results. I know I have this set to be due at the end of the day, Thursday, but I'll look at this before class starts tomorrow. So for those of you who answer this question before we start class tomorrow, I'll kind of see, which topic has like the most votes, and I'll probably try to focus a little bit more on those. Now, obviously, it's not going to be the only one I cover, but I'll try to focus a little bit more on those questions. So before you submit this quiz, think about what you want to see reviewed the most tomorrow. We'll take the next 30 minutes here to review monopolistic and competitive markets from those practice exam questions. So if that changes your mind at all, we will kind of take the next 30 minutes to review monopolistically competitive questions from that practice final. Okay. All right. So that does it for our participation quiz. I thought I downloaded that. Maybe I didn't. So we'll go to the main homepage. Oh, I did, and then I had to restart it. So we'll go down here, take a look at this practice final, and we'll work through some of the monopolistically competitive questions, since that's what we've been talking about today. So let's go down past the game theory stuff. All right. So let's say I had something like this, some type of a depiction of a market, and I'm told that this is a monopolistically competitive market below, or a monopolistically competitive firm. Okay. So what would be the profit maximizing quantity and price for a firm in this industry? So if I'm looking here, how would I identify the profit maximizing price and quantity of a monopolistically competitive firm? It's going to look just like we would for a monopolist. We go to where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's at a quantity of 3.5. We go up to the demand curve to then set the price as 17, right? Excuse me. So that would be our kind of price quantity combination. Okay. Now, I don't think I have it here. Yeah. Let's say I gave you this same graph, but I asked you what the profit maximizing quantity for the firm was. And first of all, if I asked you, is this market in the long or the short run? How would I know if it's in the long or short run? Well, at that price is below average total cost. So what would the profits of the firm be here? Well, profits are going to be the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm selling. So what? The difference is 5 in between 22 minus 17 is 5 times 3.5. So I'd be at what? 15 plus, so 17.5, but negative would be my profit value here. So what I'm kind of saying in practice, if I ever have this demand curve and this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, and at that quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm was choosing, we said that price was 17. However, the point we were at on the average total cost curve at that profit maximizing quantity was 22. Remember, we calculate profits of a monopolistically competitive firm. It's the same as all of our other profits. The quantity I'm producing times the difference between price and average total. So 3.5 times 17 minus 22 gave us what? Negative, I already forgot, 17.5 was our profits here. Okay. So here we kind of had, this was our, represented our profits, but they're negative. Okay. So one other thing that I could have in here is, once I know profits are negative, well, profits in the long run should be what? We said in the long run, firms should exit this market until that demand curve shifts up, until we get to a point where at the kind of this new demand curve, profits are driven back to 0 for the firms. So because we have negative profits, we know this firm is in the short run. What's something else we need to check? Is that price they're setting? We know it's below average total cost here, but what if I had average variable cost also drawn in? If price is below average variable cost at this point, so I'll just kind of put a number to it to have something. So let's say this was 20, right? Well, if price is ever below my average variable cost, what should the firm do to maximize profits or minimize losses? Shut down. So this would be a weird one. If I asked you to calculate profits then, if I gave you the average variable cost on that graph, well, you know, if you stay open, the profit maximizing quantity results in a loss of $17.5 or negative 17.5 profits. How would I find my profits if I am supposed to be shutting down? Well, there we said kind of one way to think about it. My profits if I shut down should be just negative whatever my fixed costs are. That's the same as my average fixed cost times quantity. So some of this stuff that we used for perfectly competitive firms applies to these monopolistic competitive firms because it's the same profit equation. How would I find my average fixed? Oh, I forgot my negative sign out front here. That's just the difference between average total and average variable. So here, at this quantity of 3.5, we had our average total cost was 22. Our average variable cost was 20. So here, what would my profits be? -7. Losing $7 is better than losing, or 7 million, whatever we're doing, is better than losing 17.5. So that pricing, that kind of decision rule, whether price is below average variable cost, yeah, that works, right? If I shut down here, I'm losing less money than if I stay open at that profit maximizing quantity. Okay. So I know I kind of added some stuff here from the original depiction in that Word document. So any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we'll return back to the original one. So we said, I think I might have already answered some of this, but if I have negative profits, right, then I know firms are going to do what? Exit the market. What's going to happen to the quantity each firm produces? Okay. So this one's kind of, it's intuitive, right? That if I have firms exiting this market, the remaining firms should all be selling a little bit more than they were before, right? They're going to pick up some of that quantity that the other firms were selling, right? But how's that going to play out? So I'll draw this as like an extreme example of that. But we said, let's just start out assuming we don't even have to have our average total cost curve drawn in. It would be somewhere here, like, right, where we had negative profits. But if we're just thinking about the quantity each firm is choosing, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, is how we choose that quantity. And then how would they choose the price? Go up to that demand curve. Okay. So I kind of want to point something else out here. I maybe potentially could ask, right? Which is if I think about that markup, so here was my marginal cost. That markup, the difference between price and marginal cost, what happens as firms exit this market? Right? I'm going to draw this really extreme. So I'm not going to change the slope of this demand and marginal revenue curve. I'm going to try to draw those parallel. As firms exit the market, each existing firm gets a higher portion of the overall demand curve. So notice the quantity that they choose will always go up as firms exit. What's going to happen to the price they set? The price will always go up as well. And then notice what's happening to that gap in between price and marginal cost. Might be harder to see, but that gap should be getting larger, right? And the reason why is because if I think about like the difference between my demand and marginal revenue curve, if the slope is still the same, at higher quantities, the gap is always going to be larger. So if I think about, let's say I had, if I had like a quantity of, I don't know, 5, right? Price and marginal cost, well, this is twice as steep. So maybe price would be something like 8, marginal cost would be 4, my markup there would be 4. Right? However, if I'm looking at a higher quantity, like out at 10, right? Well, now at a higher quantity, that resulting price might be something like 16, right? Now, half of that, right? Marginal revenue is twice as steep, would be 8. But so notice what's happening to that difference. Oh, it's getting larger. So anytime we're thinking about choosing a higher quantity as a monopolistic competitive firm, it would also result in the markup, and I tried to draw it to scale up there, but if we compared the markup from both scenarios, the markup will also be increasing. So as firms exit, the demand that each firm faces will go up. That results in a higher quantity, a higher price, and a higher markup for the firms that don't exit the market. Now, we could draw this out the same way. It really would just be going like from here to here, right? So if I think about instead, what if I had firms entering this market? Well, that would be a demand decrease. So if I wanted to, just to kind of have it written down shorthand in front of me as I'm studying, as firms enter that market, the demand each firm faces would go down. That would push quantity and price that the firms are choosing to both be lower, and that would also lower the markup. Okay, just kind of the exact, opposite effects when we have firms entering. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? So I'm throwing some additional stuff in here that, the questions might not ask. That just, think about if I did change things in some of these questions or make them a little harder or just slightly different questions. Okay. So we had what? Exit and increase there. Oh, this one, it's not supposed to be bolded, but we know the answer here. So let's think about how we find markup and excess capacity. If I ask you a question like this, hopefully this is an easy one, right? Because when we're looking at a visual depiction, the markup is the difference between our current price and our current marginal cost at that profit maximizing quantity. So there, my price is 17, marginal cost, the point I'm at that quantity is 4. So my markup there, 17 minus 4, should just be 13. So right away, I can rule out A and B. Now, what is excess capacity? Right? So excess capacity, this is where, let's say I gave you slightly different options and I had like more dashed lines here. It's not going to be kind of that, so if I'm thinking about my options, it's not going to be the difference between where supply hits the demand curve and the current quantity you're choosing. So if I were to look at this and I say, okay, they're choosing 3.5, but if it was a perfectly competitive firm, marginal cost hits demand at 5, okay, my excess capacity would be 1.5. No. So even though that's how you calculate the deadweight loss that exists in this market, the definition of excess capacity is if we had a perfectly competitive market, we wouldn't be facing this demand curve. So the point where that demand curve hits marginal cost, that wouldn't be the quantity that the perfectly competitive market is going to choose. We actually end up with this horizontal demand curve. So we know in the long run, the perfectly competitive firms, they end up at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So where would that be at? It's at a quantity of 6. So our excess capacity is at our current quantity. Where are we at in the average total cost curve? The difference between that quantity and what quantity would put us on the lowest possible point or the minimum point of the average total cost curve. So here our excess capacity would be 6 minus 3.5 or 2.5. And I would probably, I shouldn't say I know the questions I would give you on the exams or quiz wouldn't just have like a couple dashed lines. It would have like all the grid lines. So it'd be easier to like see, oh, this isn't 5.9, and this is exactly 6. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So which of the following will be true about a monopolistically competitive firm when they're in the long run? Okay. So if I've got a monopolistically competitive firm and I'm in the long run, okay, if I'm trying to draw this out for myself, okay, I should be thinking about one key factor, which is I know that in the long run, my monopolistically competitive profits are 0. Okay. So if I'm thinking about drawing my own visual depiction, I would think about, okay, I know that I'm going to have some average total cost curve, and I know that, marginal cost hits it at its minimum point. Okay. If profits are equal to 0, and this is where, I could draw different slope demand curves. I'm just going to think about if profits are equal to 0, I know that the point that I'm at on my demand curve should be exactly the same as my average total cost in order for those profits to be equal to 0. Sorry, I'm drew this a little bit wonky here, but if this was like a straight line down, there we go. So what should be true is that marginal revenue should hit my marginal cost at a quantity where when I go up to that demand curve, I'm at this point where the price that I set is exactly equal to my average total cost. Okay. So what'll be true at this point? Well, marginal revenue will be equal to marginal cost, right? That's how we were choosing that quantity. However, both of those, if I think about the marginal revenue and the marginal cost of the firm, they're both going to be less than the price that the monopolist competitive firm chooses, because marginal revenue is always twice as steep, and we set the price by going up to that demand curve. Now, in the long run, that price that we're setting should result in zero profits, so this should also be the same as the average total costs of the firm. However, that price, right, or the point where I'm at in my average total cost curve, will be above the minimum point of my average total cost curve. Okay. So if I'm thinking about which of those things are true, I think it's true, right? Or is it not true? No, it's true. Well, price being above average total, that doesn't make sense. We know profits are zero. Price has to be equal to average total cost, so that we can cross that one out. Price is above marginal cost. Well, here, if we just remember that when we have monopolistic competitive markets, we always have some markup, and the markup is just the difference between price and marginal cost. Well, yeah, then price has to be above it. The markup is something above zero. Marginal revenue is greater than, well, no, we make our profit maximizing decision where price is kind of equal to kind of marginal cost, right? Wait, did I rule out all of these? So if I've got monopolist competition, profit maximizing price, so, oh, well, this one we said we know is true. Sorry, we already answered it. Price is above marginal cost. We know that one's going to be true. So A and D aren't true. We also know C won't be true because we said the point that we get to in our average total cost curve will not be at the minimum point. So the point that we're at in the long run, when profits are equal to zero, price will be equal to our average total cost, but it's going to be at an average total cost that is greater than the minimum. So we know that price will be above that minimum point of our average total cost curve. So this one wouldn't be equal, it should be greater than. Right? So we could think about if we wanted to make all of these true, what would we do? Well, profits are zero, so price will be equal to average total cost, but that price and average total cost will be above the minimum point, and marginal revenue should be equal. That should always be true no matter what market we're looking at. That's how firms make the optimal quantity decision. It's just that they face different marginal revenues, right? Versus a monopoly versus a perfectly competitive versus monopolistic competitive market. Okay. So let's say instead we kind of had one of these more word type problems. So if I've got a quantity of 10, this is the current profit maximizing quantity, and I look at the marginal revenue and marginal costs are both 32, average total cost is 58, average variable is 45, and the price I'm charging, right, to kind of maximize profits is 52. Okay. So what will the firm's profits be? Well, first of all, if I look at the price relative to average total cost, price is below average total. So my profit equation is still the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Quantities are going to either be zero or positive, right? So if price is above average total cost, positive times a positive, I will always have positive profits. If price ever falls below average total cost, I know my profits are going to be negative. So if I'm told that my price is below average total, I know that C or D has to be the right answer. I should rule these other two out right away. Okay? Maybe I wouldn't be that nice on the exam. Maybe I would, maybe I'd give them all negative. But for here, to kind of, make that point, we know that profits will be negative. Now, the next thing we have to decide is, do we stay open? If we stay open, what would our profits be? Well, it's kind of easy because we were told quantity is 10, price is 52, average total cost is 58. Let's make sure I got those values right. Yeah, 52, 58, and 10. So if I stay open, my profits would be what? Negative 60. What are my profits if I shut down? Okay. If I shut down, we said I can calculate profits. They're just negative, whatever my fixed costs are. Another way of writing that is if I take my average fixed cost, multiply it by quantity. Another way I can write that, how do I find average fixed costs if I'm not directly given them? It's the difference between my average total and my average variable costs. So at that quantity of 10, my average total costs I was told are 58. My average variable cost, I think I was told was 45, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly. Yes. So here, if I shut down, my profits would actually be what? 13 times, so negative 130. Sure enough, when price is above my average variable cost, I should stay open, right? If that price ever falls below my average variable costs, I should shut down. Okay? So here, if I shut down, I lose $130. If I stay open, I lose negative 60. And the reason why is because, yes, my price is below average total cost, profits will be negative, but as long as it's above that average variable cost of 45, I'm actually going to be minimizing my losses by staying open. Okay. So we just worked through one where, in this case, we stay open and we calculate our profits to be negative 60. If I instead lowered that price to 38, so everything else is exactly the same. And here you'll notice, like, to calculate profits, this is just additional information I don't need in terms of the marginal revenue and marginal cost. When the price is 38, now that price is below average variable, what should I do? Well, we just said if price is below average variable, I should shut down. We already calculated these profits if I shut down. They were negative 130, but let's kind of prove why that would be minimizing our losses. So now in this second scenario, if I shut down, we had negative 130. The fixed cost will always be the same, so it's still negative 130. However, if I stay open, my profits are the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Well, now the quantity was 10, average total was 58, but we said, what if the price is at 38? Well, now I end up with profits of negative 200 if I stay open. Those losses would be greater than if I just shut down. So under this scenario, the profits of the firm, they'll choose to shut down, so they would only be negative 130. Right? I'm just kind of doing this additional work to show you that if you did stay open, you wouldn't actually be maximizing your profits, right? Because if you're trying to maximize profits, you want the smallest negative value if the choice is in between two negative values. Okay. All right. So, any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. Let's do 10 minutes left. We'll kind of talk through 30 because we kind of already did this one earlier. So if we're comparing a monopolistic competitive market to these other two markets, we said they're always going to choose kind of a lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market, but a higher quantity than the monopoly market. But if I'm just comparing them to the firm, well, then each perfectly competitive firm produces a lower quantity than a monopolist. The entire market would be at a higher quantity, but each firm would produce a lower quantity. Okay. Total surplus would be the same. Well, no, we said we know there's going to be some deadweight loss. That one doesn't make any sense. Consumer surplus will be lower than a perfectly competitive market, right? So that one we definitely know is going to be true, right? So I'll come back to that one. And they face a demand curve that is more inelastic than a monopolist. Well, it's actually going to be not as much market power, so they won't have as steep of a demand curve. Now, we said steepness and elasticities, it's not one-to-one, but in general, the flatter the curve, the more elastic. So it should be that they have a demand curve that is a little more elastic than a monopolist. But let's think about why consumer surplus we know is going to be lower. Okay. And it's lower than, sorry, we're comparing it to a perfectly competitive market. So I don't think I quite did this. Probably based off what we did, we could see this. But we said when we're looking at the entire market overall, so we got supply, demand. We know this is the perfectly competitive price and quantity. Excuse me, where or so this will be the price I put MC. This will be the perfectly competitive price and quantity where supply is equal to demand. If that was the case, what would consumer surplus be? The difference between our demand curve and the price that we're setting. Now, if I had a monopolistic competitive market, we said we know that if we're looking at the market overall, each firm is producing a smaller kind of quantity. They're not basing this off of a completely vertical demand curve. It's a slightly kind of downward sloping demand curve. So the overall quantity in the market is going to be lower. But we said we know that the price, the average price kind of across all these firms should be a little bit higher. And then we know we could have the monopolist to be even more extreme. But if I'm charging a higher price and I'm not selling as many units, we're going to lose out on all of this consumer surplus. But also notice the new prices here, new consumer surplus would only be this area here. So with monopolistic competitive markets, we know consumer surplus is going to go down. Now, it's not guaranteed that producer surplus will go down. So I'll kind of give a slightly different, I don't have enough colors. Well, I can use black here. So before, producer surplus would have been this entire area. What is it now? Well, now it's going to be the area below price, but above the supply curve. So now I've got this green area would be producer surplus. So notice, I know consumer surplus is going to go down with a monopolistic competitive market. Now, producer surplus, it's kind of like when we had price ceilings or price floor. I'm going to gain some producer surplus here. I'm going to lose a little bit here. In general, right, the area of this rectangle is going to be greater than the area of this triangle. So as long as that's the case, we could still see producer surplus go up. Even though they're not selling as many units, they're selling the units that they are selling for a higher price. And so we don't really know what's going to happen to producer surplus, but we know that with monopolistic competitive markets, we'll definitely see consumer surplus decrease. So when we're thinking about which one was true there, consumer surplus will definitely be lower than the perfectly competitive market. Total surplus will also be lower. They're going to produce at a quantity higher than, well, if we're comparing the firms, right? The competitive firm will produce at a lower quantity than monopolist. Now, the overall market would be at a higher quantity, but here we're comparing it just to a single firm. Okay. All right. And then we really already talked through 29. We said what happens when we see these demand increases. I kind of went through and we said we see price, quantity, and the markup all increase, right? So prices would increase, markups would increase. If I've increased price and I've increased kind of the quantity I'm selling here, I should also see that my profits would go up as well, as long as my total costs don't change. So this example gives you one where you increase the demand for the product, but you get a free, you didn't have to pay any money for the celebrity endorsement. So there's no change to the firm's costs. So your average total cost curve stays the same. You know that you're going to have a price, quantity, markup increase. You would also have to see that your profits are going to go up as well, because that average total cost stays the same. So if I'm thinking about, we said it was similar when we thought about firms exiting. What did that really do? Well, it was causing a demand increase. So if I can increase the demand for my product, we said that's going to result in higher prices, higher quantity, and a higher markup. But if I'm thinking about my profits, profits are the difference between price, average total costs, and quantity. So if I increase my quantity, I increase my price, and I keep my total cost the same. So maybe I'm moving at a different point on the average total cost curve. But I can think about if I'm choosing a higher quantity, if my total costs remain the same, it should then, at the very least, lower my average total cost. Remember, we said monopolistically competitive firms are operating on a portion where their average total cost curve is still decreasing. So if we see this kind of demand shift upward, it should be that value of profits is going to be higher. Okay. I probably wouldn't maybe ask you one related to kind of profits there. I would focus more on what's happening to price, quantity, and the markup of these firms when we see the demand increase from a monopolistically competitive firm. Okay. So that one should be what? We should see kind of all of them increase here. Okay. All right. Got a few more minutes left. Any other questions? Anything from yesterday? If you watched that video before today's class that you had questions on. Otherwise, we'll maybe end it here a little bit early. So tomorrow, right? We've finished everything. So I'm going to go in here and switch this over. Maybe, there we go. You'll have that module 13 quiz. So the 3 participation quizzes from this week, as well as the module 12 and 13 quiz, all due by the end of the day tomorrow. In class tomorrow, we'll simply be doing review, more of these practice exam problems. If we get through all of them, I'll start working through additional things that I think might be, wink, wink, helpful to know. And then we have that final exam on Friday. So the end is near. We're getting close here. There's no other questions. That wraps it up for material. We'll do review tomorrow and then the final on Friday.